The goal of tonight's meeting is to inform Polk County Lake Organization volunteers and other interested and concerned citizens of the potential threats from factory hog farming operations and the current status of county and town ordinances that would protect.
You're muted again, Karen.
Okay, can you hear me now? Here's the lineup of our presentations tonight. And we will have about 45 minutes of presentations and then time for audience questions. And we will finish up with closing comments from me. PCALR's mission is to promote and preserve the natural, recreational, aesthetic, and ecological qualities of our lakes and rivers, and to provide a forum for public expression, to contact and inform public officials of specific problems of our area, and to join forces when necessary to achieve a goal deemed crucial by the members to change political opinion and influence governmental bodies. The PCALR board consists of myself as president, Ray Sloss, treasurer, Kim Butler, board member at large, and Mark Lampkin, board member at large. Each of us represent a particular lake in the county, and we look for other people to join us as well who can round out the representation of Polk County lakes. PCALR members of 2021 included 15 organizations, 7 individuals, and 1 business. We run on a fiscal year, May to May, so this is 2020 to 2021. We have not all of the lake districts are represented in our membership this year, and we attribute a lot of that to the COVID crisis, which may have slowed people down from joining, especially when meetings were held via Zoom and not in person last year. Our first presentation is from Lisa Doerr, and Lisa and her husband farm in the town of Laketown, Polk County, with footage on 2 lakes, Tarbert Lake and Herbie Lake. They operate a commercial forage operation and sell to local beef, dairy, and lamb producers. Lisa served on Laketown's livestock licensing facility committee, and she's played a lead role in writing the committee's December 2020 Town of Laketown Livestock Facility Report. Lisa's also been featured in local and national media covering hog factory farms in Polk County. Lisa, I'm going to stop sharing so you can share. All right?
All right. I'll try to keep myself from being muted.
Yeah, that was weird.
All right. Thanks for having me tonight. I really appreciate PCALR taking time to look at this issue. And as I've already been introduced quite a bit, I can kind of skip the part about what my husband and I do here. In 2019, our whole community heard, and a lot of people in Burnett and Polk County, that there was an effort by a Iowa company to build a big farrowing hog plant in Trade Lake, and the town of Laketown is adjacent to Trade Lake. At the same time, our neighbors were approached by agents from the Burnett Dairy Co-op in an attempt to buy land, and one of the places that they were hoping to buy is just east of our place here, about a mile. So at that point, a lot of people in Laketown got concerned, and so did we. And so for the last 2 years, I've been trying to work at the county and town and state levels to protect our property, as well as our health. And in December, as part of our moratorium committee on livestock, we published a report, and most of the information that I'll be laying out tonight is in that report. So if people are interested in seeing more in-depth background on it, there's hundreds of links to more information. You can go to the townoflaketown.org website, and the report is on there. Starting with an overview from our perspective about this factory farm industry. It's an industry with little or no regulation and lots of subsidies. And that from our perspective, it survives because of those two factors. The only real regulation at this point is under the Clean Water Act. And the factories are not even permitted under the Clean Water Act until they have 1,000 animal units. And 1,000 animal units is equal to 2,500 hogs, or as you can see, up to 125,000 chickens. So one of the things that we're seeing, particularly in Iowa, which has a huge hog industry, is a lot of the new operations are what they call 999ers. So they'll come in at 2,499 hogs. So they're not even regulated under the Clean Water Act. Wisconsin has 319 regulated facilities under the Clean Water Act. Most of them are dairy. We have very few hog, but there are poultry. And the DNR is responsible for implementing that law. However, it's very overwhelmed, not nearly well staffed enough to do it. 90 of those 319 permits are expired. The whole Clean Water Act is set up to be self-reporting and based on whistleblowers and self-reporting. In our region of Wisconsin here on the west central side, we have one guy who is in charge of 8 counties, and that his district runs from Lake Superior down to the Mississippi River, right on the edge of Trepalow County. So there's 5 permitted factories in Polk County. 4 of them are dairy, one's poultry. And then Genio also runs quite a few, I don't really even know. Genio has turkey farms here, and those are regulated as a general permit at the state level. The heart and soul of that Clean Water Act is the nutrient management plans. And these are the plans that they put together for a farm on how to manage their manure, how to manage the nutrients coming from the manure. And unfortunately, those plans were originally designed to maximize crop production and not really to protect water necessarily or air at all. So from an ecological standpoint, we've seen a lot of problems with the nutrient management plans. And that's a whole nother subject we could spend hours and hours on. But one of the things that we found in the last couple of years here is that they can spread the manure within 25 feet of the shoreland. I'm sorry, it's not within, I should have put that, up to 25 feet of the shoreline. And at the same time, under these manure management plans or these nutrient management plans, there is no regulation of the carcasses and placentas. There's thousands of carcasses and placentas that are generated by these large plants. And there is no regulation of the air pollution. In terms of the subsidies, this industry is extremely dependent on subsidies. In fact, obviously our whole agricultural economy is, but particularly the huge factory farms. Polk County's gotten $26 million worth of subsidies in the last 10 years, and 400 recipients have gotten it. 4 of our permitted facilities, which is 1%, have gotten 12% of that money. So just 4 plants have gotten $3.4 million. And last year was a really big year for subsidies. 2020, those 4 top permitted facilities, which are 1%, got 22% of all the subsidies that came to Polk County. The other big point I wanted to make as an overview is that we're not looking at one plant. We're not looking at one farrowing plant in Trade Lake. The farrowing plant will produce 200,000 piglets, and they'll have to go to a finishing plant. What is really the push here is a systemic change in agriculture to industrial agriculture, which is driven by big capital and cheap labor. So instead of a middle-class dairy or a middle-class beef operation, we're looking at big capital and cheap labor, not people putting in their sweat and little capital. So it makes it harder and harder for young people to come in. And it's particularly, we believe, bad for Polk County because we have a very diverse economy in Polk County. Unlike a lot of rural counties, we still have a lot of small producers. We have family-owned meat processors in Luck and Frederick, Amory, Clear Lake, up in Siren. We have a manufacturing sector. We have a lot of folks commuting to the cities. And obviously, as Pickler would know, we have a lot of tourists, lake homeowners and retirees. So our very diverse economy is threatened by an economy that this type of agricultural activity. What we've seen in Wisconsin, and I have data if you want to look at it in the report, is property values dropping by 27% up to 88%, depending on where your property is. And then these two photos at the bottom are from the DNR. It just gives you a feel for what the large factory farms look like. I really wanted to say that these are factories, not farms. This is a highly consolidated, vertically integrated industry. It's dominated by 4 companies: Smithfield from China, JBS from Brazil, and Cargill from Minnesota, and Tyson, I believe, from Georgia. They're corporations or investors that build the plants, then they hire local managers to produce on contract. So they'll have a farrowing barn that'll turn out the piglets that houses the sows and the boars. And usually that breeding stock is owned by the corporation. Then they're taken to a finishing plant for 5 or 6 months until they get to maybe 250 or at the most 280 pounds. And then they're shipped to the processing plant that's owned by the corporation. So from what we've been told by the developer up in Trade Lake, they would like to supply the big Smithfield plant, which is in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Very large plant. It processes about 5% of the country's pork. And so it's a very integrated industry. In terms of ecological impacts, most people think about water when they think about the manure and the other issues, especially groundwater. We have no systematic or long-term programs testing our wells or collecting and analyzing the data. We already have problems in Polk County. We do know that. And most of our wells are private wells. Most people get their water from a private well. The current limit that's been set is 10 parts per million. And that has no legal standing on a private well. That is if a city is running a public well under the Safe Water Drinking Act, that limit has a legal bearing. But for your private well, there is no regulation on that. The county did do some testing, and I'm hoping they'll do some more. They did testing in the Balsam Lake watershed in 2019. At that point, they found 15% of our wells were already exceeding that 10 parts per million. One of the odd things is that we do have a state cleanup grant available if your well's polluted, but it's only if it's over 40 parts per million and only if it's used for livestock. So if it's for your kids, you can't get the grant, but you can if it's for livestock. And at this point, we have a situation where the legislature is blocking any attempts by Wisconsin DNR to upgrade the rules for siting these plants or the rules for the nitrogen or nitrate problems with the manure. In fact, right now we have a Supreme Court case that was just heard on April 12th, where the legislature and some of the agricultural people are actually arguing that the DNR does not have authority to regulate a giant dairy CAFO in Kewaunee County. that only the legislature can do that. So it's a pretty interesting case. The other water issue that some folks aren't aware of is the high capacity wells. These big factories use a lot of water. Some of them use a lot of water for irrigation in addition to obviously feeding the animals and everything, watering the animals. And that high capacity wells, this is kind of an interesting graphic. As you put the well down, you can actually start drawing water from streams and lakes and really affect the hydrology of an area. Right now, the Supreme Court is also hearing a case where the Big Ag is arguing that the Wisconsin DNR cannot look at the impact of a high capacity well on the neighbors' wells or on neighboring rivers and streams. So we have a situation in the Sands area of Wisconsin where the high capacity wells have lowered the lake levels, the stream levels, and people's wells. So that's a big issue. The final issue around water is the surface water. Obviously, phosphorus is the biggest nutrient issue. Most of the impaired lakes in Polk County are impaired because of phosphorus. However, nitrogen is an issue too. Again, the enforcement is self-reporting. And the poster child for the problems that the Wisconsin DNR is having is the Emerald Sky Dairy. This is a dairy that's just across the border in St. Croix County that's had multiple enforcement issues. They've had spills of over 200,000 gallons. They finally did give them an $80,000 fine, but they've had violations since then. And it got so bad that the St. Croix County Development Corporation sent a letter in February to the DNR demanding that they start enforcing these manure management plans. So the enforcement is really a problem in many places. The other ecological impact, particularly from the hog operations, is air pollution. There is no regulation of air pollution. Under Community Right to Know, under the Clean Air Act, the most typical emissions are hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, and methane. And I'm seeing a couple of you rub your eyes as I talk about this. And that's because it's a very irritating set of air pollution that comes out of these plants. There's been a lot of research done in North Carolina, particularly about the exacerbating asthma and bronchitis, causes a lot of stress. They've seen infant mortality rates go up, low birth rates, kidney disease. And the biggest thing is that you can't go outside. You know, depending on where you live and where the wind's blowing, in the summertime, you can't have your kids over for a graduation party. This is a photo of a barn that's a pretty state-of-the-art hog barn. You see all these fans that are blowing. They're blowing 24/7 to ventilate the barns so that the hogs don't die from breathing the hydrogen sulfide and ammonia. So there are no air regulations. In the social impacts, I think the biggest one for people is the property values. I mean, my husband and I have spent 40 years trying to get ourselves together and be able to have a business, and now these hog guys are coming in and telling us that that's all going to go down the drain. We're looking at 27% dropping values. The reason I put these wind roses, they're called wind roses up here, is to show you where the wind blows in Polk County. And these are taken from the airport around Osceola and Siren. And it's about 18 or 20 years worth of data of where the wind blows, depending on where you are. And in Osceola, it's mostly northwest and southeast. In Siren, as you can see, they have a lot of southwest wind and northeast wind. So depending on where you live and how the wind is blowing, you'll have more property values or less. The other thing that it does to property values is it decreases the ability to recruit new people to come in, build homes, build a business, particularly young people. really, it just crowds out other types of economic activity, particularly with the small farms. So the big farms come in, they buy everything on contract through their corporation. They don't go and buy from the local co-op and get their inputs locally. So it can have a really big impact on the economics there. Another big concern for us is that there's a lot of foreign control in this industry. We're looking at, I put up Smithfield here because we're pretty sure that's where the hogs would be going, is the Smithfield plant. Smithfield was bought by China in 2013. The Chinese Communist Party put up the $4 billion to help buy it. It included the processing plants as well as a lot of farmland. And at this point, Smithfield owns about 900,000 sows, but they also contract for more. We don't really know exactly. What's interesting is they've bought Smithfield, and they're basically using the technology and the expertise, the genetics from Smithfield to build a hog industry in China and other places. And they're particularly taking a lot of the value added type jobs to China. So we're seeing a lot of frozen carcasses shipped to China instead of that processing being done here. This is a picture of Juan Lang, who's the CEO of Smithfield at this point. And he made $291 million in 2017. So basically our property values go down and his go up. The other impact that we've seen is on local media. I don't know how many of you might have heard of Storm Lake, Iowa, but they have a very famous paper there that has done a lot of investigative reporting on what the hog industry's done to Iowa. And they actually won the Pulitzer Prize in 2018. And they have had to set up a foundation in order to run their newspaper because they've lost so much advertising to the industry. And in 2019, our paper, the Intercounty Leader, was threatened that it would lose advertising if it didn't follow, if it kept up the type of reporting it was doing on CAFOs. In Lafayette County, Wisconsin, which is southern Wisconsin, the county board actually tried to pass an ordinance that would ban the media from publishing well data. And that wouldn't be the names of the people on the wells, but the aggregate well data. So our local media are under a lot of pressure already. And then this has been another impact for them to deal with. The labor issue is also real big. As these large investor-run factory farms have grown, they've driven out the middle-class farms. Thousands of them have been lost. And what they do is they bring in cheap immigrant labor in the production factories and in the processing plants. So we have over 1 million people that as far as they can tell, that are running the production and slaughterhouses. And there is no exact data on how many of them are documented or undocumented, but a study that was done by the Dairy Federation showed that 78% of the dairies are concerned about immigration rates. And there is a push right now to pass a new immigration law. And I believe it's passed the House, maybe some of you guys know for sure, but and the idea of that would be that they would legalize these workers, but only if they stayed in big ag. So they'd basically be indentured to stay in the slaughterhouses or in the production houses in order to become citizens. Couple other things is disease. With COVID-19, a lot of the big processing plants had to shut down completely or really cut back. So we saw a lot of pigs that had to be euthanized and buried. This was right across the border in Minnesota. African swine fever has had a huge impact on China. This picture here is where they're trying to spread disinfectant all over. Many barns suffer fires. This is a fire that was in Mondovi a couple years ago. And then because there's always millions of pigs moving around on the highway all the time, being moved from farrowing plants to finishing plants, people buying pigs from Canada, bringing them here, taking them to North Carolina, moving them to Iowa. There's a lot more highway crashes that we're seeing. So that pretty well wraps it up. What can we do? We can't ban CAFOs. We can't ban hog CAFOs from Polk County. As I always say, they got to Madison before we did. Under the state law, we cannot do that, but we can pass strong regulation, particularly strong application fees, performance bonds, setbacks, and have these facilities prove that they're not going to pollute. So I think that's what Andy Marshall is going to cover.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you for having me tonight. I really appreciate it.
It was great to hear all of this information. We all appreciate you. Our next presenter is Andy Marshall from Bassford Remley. Andy is an attorney, a corporate attorney who also has farm in Burnett County. Andy's going to talk with us about the Town of Eureka Ordinance, which he was instrumental in crafting. Andy, you can go ahead and share your screen.
Okay, I think it says I gotta wait until you're.
Okay,
not-
all right, go ahead. I guess it's only me who can share over everyone else. There we go.
Well, that's the- Are you seeing the title page for Town of Eureka Concentrate Animal?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, we are. Looks good.
Well, I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to speak tonight. I was asked to just go through the ordinance that we drafted for Trade Lake, or excuse me, for Eureka. And so that I don't take credit when it's not due, the ordinance for Eureka is really in large part the same ordinance that was passed in Trade Lake, with some changes made to fit Eureka. There is essentially a couple different avenues that you can take, or approaches you can take in terms of CAFO regulation. The first is siting regulation, and you're dealing with Wisconsin statutes, section 9390, or operational regulation, which is the route that we went in Eureka and in Trade Lake. There's no reason why you can't do additional regulations in terms of siting. You just have to follow the guidelines that are contained in 9390. The case that deals with that a lot of CAFO proponents try to say shows that governmental subdivisions can't regulate CAFOs is the Adams case. And the Adams case actually says the opposite. The Adams case says, it's a Wisconsin Supreme Court case, it says that you can, a town can regulate CAFOs. They regulate the siting of CAFOs. They just have to follow the guidelines. And in particular, they have to have reasonable and scientifically based findings of fact to support any guidelines that are more stringent than the state standards. So first you got to adopt the state standards, and then you can have guidelines that are more stringent than the state standards. But if you do so, you have to have this reasonable and scientifically based findings of fact to support those standards. And there's a lot of information out there to support enhanced regulations of CAFOs. So again, the Eureka ordinance is operational, it's not citing. And what that means is it's going to affect a CAFO once they've already been allowed to locate within the town of Eureka. This ordinance then would govern how they have to operate when they're in that town. And it's important to note that this avenue is proceeding mostly under Wisconsin statute section 9215, And it's really designed, the central purpose of this is to protect the public health, safety, and the general welfare of the residents. It has some aspects of protecting water quality, air quality, but the primary purpose of this ordinance is to protect the public health and safety of residents. And these things are specifically stated in the ordinance, and it's important to do that, to state the general purposes in the ordinance and also to state what the specific findings of fact are that the particular governmental subdivision has reached. And those can be in attachments, those can be specifically stated in the ordinance, but in the Eureka ordinance, the purpose of the ordinance is to effectively and efficiently and comprehensively regulate the operation of large-scale concentrated animal feeding operations, 1,000 animal units or greater. So that's where the threshold is for the Eureka ordinance. And it's important because none of the towns in this area want to say to moderately sized farms that we're going to control you, or we're going to further regulate you, or we're going to regulate you out of business, which is, I think, is a concern for a lot of farmers. This ordinance and the Trade Lake ordinance only applies to those agricultural operations that are 1,000 animal units or greater. And practically speaking, there aren't a lot of those in this area. The ordinance specifically says that it's regulating CAFOs without respect to siting. So in other words, it's explicitly saying we're not looking at siting, we're looking at how do you operate once you've been cited. And again, the primary goal is to protect the public health, safety, and general welfare of the residents. And by the way, if anyone wants to look at the ordinance itself, it is on the Eureka Town website. I'm not going to go through this particular slide again, but one of the things that we note in this ordinance is that there is ample scientific research and evidence establishing that CAFOs pose a significant risk to the integrity of the groundwater in particular areas, to the surface water, to air quality, and to health and well-being of residents. And that's not only stated in a general way, but those things are gone through in detail in the ordinance, so that if the ordinance, or when the ordinance comes up for review, then those, the DNR or others reviewing the ordinance, can see that thought went into it and that there's actually a valid scientific basis for additional regulations that the town wants to impose. So the ordinance specifically identifies risk areas for CAFOs, which include groundwater, which is wells, drinking water, surface water, which includes everything from ditches and streams and lakes and ponds to rivers, air quality, greenhouse gases and climate change, because apparently large CAFOs give off a lot of greenhouse gases, odors, and odors is different from air quality in that, I mean, I'm gonna get into this a little bit more detail because the ordinance does, but odors is just the superficial, it smells bad, right? And that gets to the point that Lisa was making about how in a lot of these areas where there's concentrated CAFO presence, you can't go outside because it smells so bad. That's different from air quality, because air quality looks at what the specific chemicals, is there ammonia in the air and that type of thing. So it's a different issue. One of the issues is insect vectors, because these CAFOs don't operate in a vacuum. Flies, mosquitoes, other insects have access to these concentrated manure areas, and then they transmit diseases by flying into neighbors' houses, yards, that type of thing. One of the things that the ordinance looks at is the pathogens. There are various diseases. I think there's 150 something pathogens that are typically contained in livestock manure. One of the concerns is antibiotic resistance. We'll talk about that a little bit. And then, of course, as Lisa mentioned, the decline in property values. And just to clarify, Lisa has a slide up, but those values can decline anywhere from in the mid 80s, a decrease in the mid 80s of property value within a 1/10 of a mile of a CAFO to, down in the teens, a reduction in 10-15% when you get miles away from the CAFO, depending upon how the air moves and what the topography is like. So getting back to some of these issues like smell and air quality. So when you smell that odor from a CAFO, it's not just odor, it is chemicals. And so the ordinance for Eureka specifically lists what some of the issues are, what some of the chemicals are that are given off by CAFOs, which include ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, methane, and also the particulate matter. And as you can see on the right-hand column here, the various emissions can have different deleterious effects. For instance, ammonia is a respiratory irritant. It can cause chemical burns. It can cause eye irritation, coughing, and chronic lung disease. Hydrogen sulfide can cause inflammation of the moist membranes of the eyes and respiratory tract and the olfactory neuron loss. So again, it's not just smell, there's actual chemicals involved in the odors. There's also, we've listed some of the pathogens, and again, I'm not going to go through these, but you can see there's some significant pathogens that are in the manure and that can be transmitted either by, as I said, insect vectors, or, you know, it's interesting that a lot of the focus in CAFOs goes to what is the construction of the facility like? You know, do they have, is the underground manure storage, is there integrity there? So it's not going to have leaks into the area around the storage facility. But then with all the attention that's paid to making sure there's no leaks, you know, a couple times a year, they take all that manure and they dump it on farm fields in the area. The particular CAFO that has made the application for Trade Lake has itself estimated that it's going to generate in excess of 9 million gallons of manure every year. And it's going to be disposing of that manure by dumping it on thousands of acres of local farm fields every year. And one of the concerns that we deal with in terms of the pathogens is the generation of antibiotic resistant bacteria. For the Trade Lake CAFO study committee, we had an immunologist come and speak to us, and he described this process, and really it's kind of survival of the fittest. What happens is you have a large amount of antibiotics that are given to the livestock. About 75% of the antibiotics passes through the livestock into the manure. And you have various bacteria that generate and that live in the manure and replicate in the manure. And some of the antibiotics will kill some of the bacteria, and those that survive then get concentrated. So those that survive proliferate, the weak ones that are affected by the antibiotics die. And so then when the manure is spread, it can be spreading concentrated kind of super bacteria that aren't affected by the antibiotics. One of the concerns that the immunologist that came and spoke to us had was that a lot of the antibiotics that they give to, for example, hogs are the tetracycline family of antibiotics, which is the same family that is used to treat humans. And it's also specifically that same family that's used to treat Lyme's disease. And of course, this area is big for Lyme's disease. And right now it's relatively easy to treat. It's just a course of antibiotics. But if you develop antibiotic resistant Lyme's disease, then the treatment is going to have to involve hospitalization, and it won't be responsive to antibiotics. So that's obviously a concern. So what this ordinance is designed to do is to make sure that before a CAFO begins to operate, all the operational risks of that particular CAFO are analyzed, and then a control, a base is established, and each CAFO would be looked at, each application would be looked at individually. Obviously, the concerns, there's latitude here that the town would have. The concerns for a 1,001 animal unit CAFO aren't going to be the same as they are for a 10,000 animal unit CAFO, and that's something that the town can look at and can adjust to in the regulations that it imposes on a potential CAFO. So again, it only applies to 1,000 animal units or more. The town board would consider a CAFO application. The application is something that's particular to Eureka. They will have their own specific application. They can grant a permit either with or without conditions. And what they're going to require is that the applicant, so the potential CAFO operator, has to show the town by clear and convincing evidence that it can comply with the requirements of the town in its operation. And the central focus or the central purpose of the conditions is to protect the public health, safety, and general welfare, and also to prevent pollution and prevent environmental concerns. There's going to be an application fee in this particular ordinance of $1 per proposed animal unit. Again, they'll have to complete the town application. There's also a provision where they have to reimburse the town for legal expenses or other costs incurred in processing the application. And that's really significant because, you know, if you have what might be a sophisticated organization coming in from, say, Iowa or some other producer state to a small town in northwestern Wisconsin, where the small town may never have faced any of these issues before, and yet they're expected to evaluate it and figure out whether or not this is going to be harmful to its town or whether or not they should approve the operation of this CAFO. That's, if they're going to do it correctly, that's going to involve some expense. That's going to involve maybe consulting with lawyers, maybe consulting with engineers, maybe consulting with hydrogeologists, and that costs money. It can break a small town if they have to fund that themselves. And it makes sense that if an outside industrial operation or agricultural operation wants to come in and make profit off of a smaller town, that they have to foot that bill. There's also a provision in this ordinance that notice will be provided to all landowners within 3 miles of the CAFO, so that when there is a town hearing or town meeting to discuss the application, that all the interested people are aware of it, come and speak or listen to what's going on. The application will be approved or denied based upon a majority vote of the board. There's also a requirement in this ordinance for financial surety to make sure that the applicant has the wherewithal to operate safely and to address any contamination or other damages. That's also huge. You want to make sure that whatever entity is operating this a CAFO anywhere has the financial wherewithal to address any damages that it causes. I mean, I litigate this issue all the time in other contexts, and I just tried a case like this where the party that I sued, and I got $1 million judgment from my client, and it was an LLC that was operating this business. And that's great, you get a big judgment, but the LLC may not have any assets. It's very common for corporate entities like this or businesses like this to have one entity own the business. As Lisa said, one entity owns the livestock. So if the business is the operator, and for example, say you get a huge manure spill, contaminates wells, causes injury, illness, or death, there's a lawsuit against the entity. Well, the entity might be an empty shell that maybe owns the real estate, that maybe it has mortgaged. So it has basically zero assets. And the entity that owns the livestock is a separate entity that's not the operator. And so any damage that's caused, there's really no recourse. And so it's important to know that you've got some sort of financial surety there, so that if there's a problem, there's some entity that can be financially responsible to correct the issue. So I'm really quickly going to run through these, the conditions, and these conditions are not specific. This is what is applied. These conditions are really areas for consideration. One of the things that needs to be done is that these need to be fleshed out a little bit. We're in that process now in Trade Lake, where we're talking to different experts and figuring out, for example, if we want to have a base level of, for example, the nitrates and phosphate levels locally. We want to have a base level for antibiotic resistant bacteria locally, so that we know if there's a dramatic change once some entity starts operating, it can be connected back to the entity, because in terms of litigation, which is what I do, that's always the biggest issue, is causation. If there's a change in something, how do you show that it was caused by the entity as opposed to caused by environmental factors or caused by another entity? So they want to establish a base. So the conditions, some conditions generally may relate to the operational characteristics of the proposed entity or operation. Some management of animal and other waste. Again, that's the manure. How is that handled? Do you have to have nutrient management plans for each piece of property? Do you have test wells for each piece of property where the manure is going to be spread? Not just the facility itself, but if you're dumping millions of gallons of manure on thousands of acres of property year after year, testing the area where the manure is being dumped is going to be a significant issue. Conditions relating to the population and depopulation of individual animal housing facilities. And I think some of that may relate to traffic, some of it may relate to trucking, roads, some of it may relate to how carcasses are dealt with. The conditions relate to biosecurity and maintenance of animal health and welfare to prevent the spread of animal-borne and vector-borne diseases. Again, going back to antibiotic-resistant bacteria, going back to illnesses within the farrowing barn that you might have, making sure it would stay contained in the barn, not spread to other local livestock, that type of issue. Conditions relating to transportation of animals as part of the ongoing operations. There's going to be a lot of truck traffic on an operation like the proposed CAFO for Trade Lake. That means there's going to be a lot more wear and tear for the roads. That means there's going to be a lot of noise. That means there's going to be a lot of dust. It's going to be something that's a completely different, it's going to be a game changer, I think, for any local area, any small town like Trade Lake to have a big entity like this also coming in and trucking animals in and out all the time. Conditions relating to protection of private and public drinking and agricultural wells and other public water supplies. Again, that might mean test wells. It might mean that the entity has to, before it starts to operate, get a base level of testing. It might require that an entity retain a third-party testing company to do periodic testing, and that the entity shares that information with the town, with the county, with the state, whoever, whatever is appropriate. Conditions relating to air emissions and dust control as part of the ongoing operation. As Lisa mentioned, you get these big barns and there's these huge fans blowing the air out to keep the livestock safe. But a lot of these barns, surprisingly, do not have filtration of existing, of outgoing air. I spoke to a representative of Cumberland LLC and asked about that. And the barn that they're considering for Trade Lake, initially the statement was made that, oh yeah, it's going to have filtration. And when that was further probed, it turns out the filtration is for the incoming air to protect the livestock, but no filtration for the outgoing air. So everyone who's near that barn is going to get just full blast of the outgoing air without any sort of filtration whatsoever. It was described that the barn is going to be filter ready, but not filtered. And that putting in a filtration system for the outgoing air might cost $1 million. That's probably not something that's just going to be done voluntarily unless there's some sort of requirement by a town, for example, that all outgoing air also be filtered. Conditions relating to private and public property rights and property values. And that's a tough one, but it's pretty much guaranteed that any property directly adjacent to a CAFO or within 1/10 of a mile is going to have a significant drop in its property value. And there seems to be I would think, a fundamental fairness issue where you have a landowner, and it could be another agricultural entity, or it could be a lake homeowner who's had a property maybe 25 years. They've owned it and the value has been going up and they've been paying off their mortgage, and then this place moves in and the property value decreases by 80%. There's got to be some sort of way of addressing that, because it doesn't make sense to allow a big agricultural entity to come in and make a profit at everyone else's expense and not be responsible for any of that. There are conditions relating to permit compliance, enforcement, monitoring, et cetera. That kind of speaks for itself. Number 10 is conditions relating to the monitoring of surface water, groundwater, air quality. Again, that goes to whether there's testing wells. We've had some presenters who've talked to us about the different types of monitoring that can be done for air quality, for surface water, and for ground surfaces to see what the contaminants might be and see whether that changes. And then there's just kind of a catch-all, any other condition that the town deems reasonable in order to have a facility safely operate. The last thing I want to talk about is that the ordinance also does provide for penalties for violation of the ordinance, which of course is important. The first of which is fines. That's again self-explanatory. It also allows for injunctive relief, and what that means is that if you have an operator that's violating the ordinance, the town can go to the courts and get an injunction to either stop a particular practice, or if it's pervasive enough, to stop operations of a facility until it can bring itself back to compliance with the ordinance. And then finally, there's the opportunity stated in the ordinance that if there are violations, the town can actually revoke a permit to operate. And that, I believe, is all I had.
Thank you, Andy. I think that's more information than I've ever seen about factory farms.
I'll talk fast. So someone asked a question, is it within the realm of reasonability to require a bond to be posted, say 10 million, 50 million, to ensure that money is available for cleanup if needed, like a damage deposit? What the ordinance for Eureka provides is a cash bond or a letter of credit with a bank so that it can be accessed easily by the town if there's an issue. The amount is always a controversial thing. Could you require a $50 million bond? I think that'd be hard. It's really related to what the risk is. And so I think that, again, that's something that actually needs some research, which involves going out and seeing, okay, when there've been manure spills, what has the cost of remediation been? What has the cost for monitoring or replacing, putting in new wells been around the area, so that you really have a handle on what it actually costs to address a problem or address a breach of the operational ordinance, and then set the amount of the bond so it's commensurate with what those reasonable expenses might be.
Okay, thank you. Moving on with our presentations. Next up is Jason Kjeseth, zoning administrator with Polk County Land Information Department. Jason, I'm just going to let you go ahead and share your screen. Jason's going to talk to us about the current laws on the books in Polk County regulating CAFOs. Jason, I think you're muted. There you go.
Sorry about that. Now can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Thank you.
So in that, Polk County was also involved in the CAFO project, and that of 2020, where there was a lot of changes from the current ordinances and that to address some of the CAFO concerns that the county previously did not have any regulations for. It does affect on that a lot of our towns in northern Polk County and of course southern Burnett County. With that, I would just like to jump into the introduction. So Polk County started off in that by adopting a moratorium on swine CAFOs in October of 2019. That was a 6-month moratorium, and the statutes provided the county the ability to extend it once, which for another 6 months. So that moratorium expired in October of 2020. During that time, Polk County worked on a large-scale livestock facilities report that was with staff. We had a lot of public comment. We actually held public hearings in that for each stakeholder group. We had one that was basically the ag producers in that of the county. The other one that we had was the town officials and any legislators in that might be interested. And then the third one and that we had was concerned citizens and concerned residents of Polk County. And the idea behind holding that was to try to get feedback from all various groups while we were working through this ordinance amendment process. So just a little bit on the zoning side, we have 2 main ordinances for the county that regulate land uses, and that's the Polk County Shoreland Protection Zoning Ordinance and the Comprehensive Land Use Ordinance. The Shoreland ordinance applies to all the unincorporated areas of Polk County. And roughly, this is kind of a tough number in that right now, but approximately 50% of the county falls within the shoreline zoning area or underneath the Polk County shoreline zoning ordinance. The reason why I say that is kind of a moving target is because as we get better with determining our ordinary high water marks on some of these small ponds and creeks and rivers and stuff, we're constantly updating our maps and that to have a better idea where these areas are. The comprehensive zoning ordinance only applies to the towns that have adopted county zoning, and that every town has the ability to either adopt into county zoning, have their own zoning ordinances, or choose to be unzoned and have no land use in that regulations outside of the shoreland area. So 18 towns have adopted county zoning, 3 towns have their own zoning ordinances, and 5 towns are unzoned. And those are the only towns in that for the comprehensive area. Like I said, the shoreland goes everywhere in Polk County. When we look at every zoning district in either of these ordinances, we have the allowed uses, which are simply if you're zone commercial and you want to operate a commercial retail store, that would fall into the allowed use category. The permitted use category, that might be something that you would be more familiar with, would be a tourist rooming house or a short-term rental. And that is something that's generally allowed, but we issue a permit on it because then we can enforce standard conditions that are in the ordinance. And we have something in that to revoke in case those conditions are violated. For both of those, there's no real public process in that is involved. When we look at somebody that wants to apply, and that basically, you wake up one day and they're starting to do it. So the conditional use option is unique in the fact that it allows a governmental body, and that either a board of adjustment or land information committee, as the statutes are, to hear through a public hearing each application that would be submitted by the applicant. And from that, they can basically look at each property individually and assign conditions on that particular use that might be relevant in order to mitigate some criteria that's in the ordinance and to further the purpose and intent of the shoreland zoning ordinance or comprehensive land use ordinance, to protect public health and safety and to mitigate, and that erosion and those kinds of things. So that's a huge benefit, and that with a conditional use is we got a public hearing. People are, noticed ahead of time. We only provide notices in that to the property owners within 300 feet of the property. But we do include a 2-week notice in the paper. So that's just a standard class 2 legal notice. And then the last one is a prohibited use, and a prohibited use cannot occur in that zoning district. So either in that you have to get it rezoned, or the ordinance would have to be amended, that kind of stuff. So many of you are aware in that when I talk about shoreline zoning, it's basically the area within 1,000 feet of a navigable lake or pond and 300 feet of a river or a stream. It's also 300 feet from the floodplain boundary, if that applies. Polk County zoning, and that has jurisdiction basically from the ordinary high water mark landward, and the DNR has the jurisdiction below the ordinary high water mark. When we look at our shoreline zoning ordinance, the county created the definition of a swine concentrated animal feeding operation, CAFO, which means a swine feeding operation with 1,000 animal units or more. Going back to what we've seen already tonight, and that 1,000 animal units of swine is roughly 2,500 animals. Through all of this and that, the Polk County Board of Supervisors did take and make a swine CAFO a prohibited use in the shoreland areas. That's underneath Article 5D, the general provisions of the Polk County Shoreline Protection Zoning Ordinance. So basically that roughly 50% of the county is not a suitable location to have any swine CAFO. Then when we look at our comprehensive land use ordinance, we've got numerous zoning districts ranging from residential to mining, and then everywhere in between. And as Lisa mentioned, and that is that the county has to provide an available area and that, or an available procedure to allow these types of factory farms. We cannot come out and prohibit them 100%. So when looking at our various zoning districts and thinking about if we did have to, go through an application process with one of these facilities, what zoning district would it fall into the best? And after some consideration, and that the committee and the county board and that went with the agricultural 20 or the A2 zoning classification. So that is the only zoning district and that would be suitable for a swine CAFO. The definition of a swine CAFO from the Shoreland ordinance was also put into the comprehensive land use ordinance. When we look at the Ag 20 zoning district, that zoning classification is set up to have the smallest residential density, except for farmland preservation. The 20 stands for one house for every 20 acres, or 2 houses per 40. So that's, much greater in that lot sizes and lower density than what we have in some of our other zoning classifications. Ag 20 is not very common in the county currently, and that before the ordinance amendment, the town of Eureka had quite a bit of Ag 20 zoning in it, but as part of this amendment, the town of Eureka petitioned the Polk County Board to change the Ag 20 zoning classification to an Ag 10 zoning, and that was completed. So the nice thing about limiting use to a specific zoning district is that anytime a property has to be rezoned, it allows the towns to have the authority or the control at the front end. And if a town doesn't approve of a rezone, they're not even able to bring it to the county. So with the town of Eureka ordinance, and that I feel that the county's ordinance would actually work hand in hand with them, because in order to be zoned to Ag 20, they currently don't have any Ag 20 zoning. So they would get the first chance to say, and that they could take and look at their ordinance at that time and link the two together, and the county and the town would be able to move forward together on that project. So there's a pretty nice tie there for that. In the Ag 20 zoning district, it's not one of those allowed or permitted uses, and that it is a conditional use, and that is found in section 10.46 C2 of the comprehensive land use ordinance. Okay, and when we look at the CUP on that, or it's commonly abbreviated to CUP, and that's the conditional use standards that are found in both the Shoreland and the comprehensive land use ordinance. These are the criteria that an elected official or an appointed member on a board of adjustment would look at when they're looking at an application and deciding what types of conditions they can legally put on the operation. And so the maintenance of safe and healthful conditions and prevention of pollution and sedimentation through erosion, and going on to having, topographic features considered in the application. Like I said, and that if we have a site that's completely flat, and that we might not have as much erosion control as a site and that has substantial slopes to it. The location of the site, and that with floodplains and rivers and streams, of course, that's a major concern, because if we don't have any of those features, we might not have as much risk for pollution. But if we do have that, or if we are close to any environmentally sensitive areas, even wetlands, then we could have extra conditions and extra requirements for like buffers and stuff like that from those sites. I already mentioned in that the erosion potential, also in that the location of the site with respect to the roads, that can be a big topic, in that, and a big concern for our local towns and that are trying to maintain their roads and do so with limited tax dollars. The need of the proposed use for a shoreland location, or any location of that matter. So again, the shoreland area is going to be prohibited. But if it's just outside of the shoreland zoning area, is that a suitable location, or is there maybe a better alternative location? And that falls into its compatibility with the adjacent land uses and surrounding, citizens and businesses that may be affected in that by the proposed use. So these are all stuff that they can create standards on. If the conditional use application doesn't meet any of these, they can also deny that conditional use permit 100%. So this is kind of a condition that might not be generated so much and that for human waste, but the amount of waste generated and that, like manure, and that could also be one of the standards that they look into. So and some of the location factors, that is again trying to see the compatibility with the existing and surrounding area with the new proposed use. So the committee, like I said, and that reviewed the livestock facility report that was completed by staff. We had numerous public hearings, and basically came, and that we even had presentations here at the county, and that from DNR and DATCAP officials. After going through all that, the county kind of found in that what we can regulate is kind of limited. Because we do have the DNR, which is regulating through WPDES permit, or basically a discharge pollution permit. You also have DATCAP, which has an administrative code of ATCP 51, and those are very limiting in what the county can enforce. So that's why the county decided to go the zoning route. And in doing so, with this conditional use permit in the comprehensive ordinance, they developed some prerequisite conditions, basically, in that to help an applicant say, you got to meet all of this on that before you can even apply for a conditional use permit. And our land and water resources office and that was involved in this as well, because they're the ones that are administering the manure management ordinance and working with producers for doing the nutrient management plans, and that are also linked in our zoning ordinance here. So that also, is going to be another tie that both offices and the town would all be in on this process from the start. So that's the first condition, is the nutrient management plan. And the last sentence there is to ensure that the land base is sufficient to handle the waste, and that it was mentioned that there was 9 million gallons of manure. That nutrient management plan was set kind of the requirements needed in order to grow a good crop on the land, and it'll tell them how much net of manure they can apply and not over apply. So that's basically what a nutrient management plan does. It will, if your soil test results come back too high eventually because you've over applied, at that point it'll actually cut them back and try to take and get those levels reduced. So another issue and that we had some public comment on was about farm entrances being at least 100 feet from a non-farm driveway. There was a lot of concerns in that about truck traffic and pulling in and out, and just large equipment in general being close to another driveway, and that's not related to the farm. This is the third bullet point here, is kind of a catch-all, and that the operation must take and remain in compliance with all state and federal rules pertaining to livestock facilities. Basically, that one is in there, and that because if the DNR is having problems enforcing an issue, or if DATCAP has a violation of the outfit, then zoning could also step in and go through the enforcement actions in our ordinance, and that which, like the town of Eureka's, does have a revoking of the permit condition and citations or fines for every day that the property remains out of compliance. And to address the roads, and that we included a condition in that about obtaining approval from our local towns prior to hauling any overweight loads during the spring breakup period. It's something in that we hear from our towns, and that ag is exempt, and there's a whole list of things that are exempt from our road bans. But at the same time, and that they still do a lot of damage. So we put that in there as a condition. And the last one there, and that is that there'll be no discharge from the animal lots or the feeding areas to navigable waters or mapped wetlands. So the administrative code provides some guidelines in that for waste storage structures, including manure storage and the feed storage. They put maximum setbacks that a county can require, and that to a property line. And that's one of the things in that the county was able to determine what they wanted to require, and it was set at 200 feet. It can be more restrictive than that. So if the committee was looking at that and said, yeah, we really need that to be 300 feet from the property line, that could always be done. So for an enforcement thing, all livestock on the premise shall be counted towards the total animal units, so that they can't say, I got, 50 head of beef over there and 10 horses, and that they don't count. So that's where that provision falls. And then the 200-foot setback from the nearest property line was for that feed storage as well. The operator would also be required to provide a 24-hour contact number for the DNR and the owner operator in case there was a spill. And they shall notify the town chairperson, county land and water resources and land information department, and numerous other agencies within 24 hours of a spill. And upon receiving that notification, we would be posting that in the newspaper for 1 week and on the county website, just to try to get the word out there so that people know what's going on. The comprehensive ordinance requires a mortality management plan for any of the deceased animals on site. That's pretty common even with the DNR's permitting and that, so that's kind of a duplicate, but it just gives us one other tool and that to enforce in the toolbox. So, and there's a requirement there in that the second bullet point that all the plans are kept up to date with all of the parties involved, which includes us in the Land Information Department, Land and Water, the DNR, DATCAP, and also the town chairman. Again, going back and that to make sure and that we are working with our local towns, because we do realize that some of these towns do have their own ordinances and are going to be possibly very concerned if we had this type of operation or had a spill. So, and then the applicant shall also disclose any previous livestock facility violations. And that is mentioned earlier in that about them having multiple operations underneath one parent company. And sometimes they might not have a clean track record. So that might just provide extra information for the committee. And there could be extra conditions possibly that would meet the conditions of the ordinance that could be then put into place to try to prevent any continuing violations that happen someplace else in Polk County. So they would have to comply with the Polk County Manure and Water Quality Management Ordinance, like a lot of our ag operations do. Any suspected case of health hazard would be referred to the Polk County Health Department. That's basically a catch-all for them and that for us to be able to involve Polk County Health. And that owner operator and that would have that phone number that would be available to the public and that must live at least within 5 miles of the farm so that, in case there is a spill or somebody needs to be contacted and that it should be pretty easy to get a hold of them. And of course, in a facility like this is probably going to have professionally drawn plans, but that is something and that is included. And that is one of the conditions is that they were all drawn and that so that the committee can understand what they are requesting very clearly. So with that, I can open it up for any questions in that, or if you want to contact us tomorrow, there's my number, and then there's also the Polk County Zoning Office general line.
Jason, there were 3 questions in the chat for you.
Okay. You bet.
Are nutrient management plans required for all farms over 1,000 animals?
Yes, they are.
Does a nutrient management plan address manure that runs off into ditches or adjacent properties?
Address manure that runs off into ditches or in that, yeah, usually it's just a cleanup measure and that for that. And that nutrient management plan and that themselves and that only address the acreage or that's in the field. Then it looks like there's another one. If there's an unusual rain, storms, destruction, okay, are they responsible for the cleanup of their operation? So we received the guidance in that from DATCAP that financial surety bond and that was not so something that was legal and that to enforce through a citing ordinance. So that's why we do not have a performance bond in the ordinance. Who owns the ditches along the surrounding roads to the facility? That varies in that a lot of times in the country where this type of facility is located, the property owner typically owns to the middle of the road. If that's around a lake and that, then there's often a lot of roads that are within a platted roadway. And so those might be owned by the town or maybe an association or maybe a combination of all the property owners along that road. Jeff Peterson had a comment about CAFO is located in the Shoreland districts, but what about spreading manure? That kind of goes back to the DNR storm or DNR manure ordinance, and also the county's manure quality or manure ordinance. They are allowed to spread within the shoreland areas. They're just not able to have stockpiles for a long time and that within the shoreland areas. How close can manure be spread and that to lakes? Anytime they're within the shoreland area, again, this is kind of a land and water question. But I did talk to them before this meeting. Anytime they're spreading within the shoreland area, it is suggested that they take and incorporate any fertilizer or manure within 3 days. And again, they can't have the stockpiles and that. So, but as far as a setback to the lake, there is no setback. Kim Butler had a comment here, where on the county website can we find a zoning map for Ag 20? If you just go to our GIS map, Polk County, Wisconsin GIS interactive map, they'll come up, it'll have an overview map of the county, and there'll be a department map tab kind of on the top. If you hit that, then you can scroll over and there's another drop down menu to zoning, and then that'll show you a zoning map of the whole county. And then there'll be a legend there that will show what color Ag 20 is. Percentage of the county that is zoned Ag 20, and that with Emily there, it's a very small percentage, and that you're probably only looking at maybe a couple thousand acres and that. So there's a little bit of it in Lincoln and a couple other towns, but it's very limited. Who has the jurisdiction when manure runs off into lakes and wetlands? That's a DNR and a county land and water resources jurisdiction issue.
Aren't wetlands federally under federal jurisdiction?
And that, yeah, that'd be underneath the Department of Army Corps. But a lot of times in that they get more involved with like disturbing of a wetland or filling of a wetland. And that usually in that it's DNR and that for the contamination of a wetland. So, and the cleanup efforts. So.
Okay. So to recap, the location, the zoning location of a large animal operation can only be in an Ag 20 zone. Is that correct? Or is it
Correct.
also in A10 zones?
No, correct. And that underneath our comprehensive land use ordinance, and that swine CAFO is a conditional use within the Ag 20 zoning district only. So, yep.
Okay.
And it's prohibited within any of the shoreland areas. So,
However, the towns that are not zoned are not covered. So the 5 towns that do not have zoning are not covered by this, I think.
correct. The 5 unzoned towns and the 3 town zone towns are not covered by the comprehensive land use ordinance. However, the shoreland ordinance would still take care of any shoreland areas within those towns.
And all of them are subject to manure spreading within 25 feet or without any restriction of setback from a body of water.
The manure ordinance, and that applies to all properties within the county, but there is no limitation as far as how close they can spread, and that to a waterway. And a lot of our fields even have waterways and that man-made within them, and that. So that's one of the issues there.
Right, so it could be a direct influx into a waterway of manure.
Correct. Just like anything else, with people spreading, fertilizer on their lawns that you guys are dealing with a lot around the lakes, and that there's many different contamination sources in that, including septics like Colton mentioned earlier. And that, so all of those things and that can be, contributing factors. So.
Now, there's another question here. Is the jurisdiction dependent on the location of the manure source?
No, and that as far as jurisdiction, so let's say that an operation was to come into Burnett County, the nutrient management plan would still be handled through Polk County Land and Water if they were spreading manure in Polk County. So, yep, it's not based on where the home outfit is located.
Okay. I think that your statement about the type of pollution to the water from manure spreading is equivalent to putting fertilizer on your lawn by the lake might be a little misleading, considering the manure in these facilities may be full of the antibiotics that Andy Marshall talked about, and the other things that or contaminants that would come from this kind of an operation. Knowing that, wouldn't we want to be more restrictive about how manure is spread?
So I guess my comment there and that was just to say that there's many factors in that can affect, and that are nutrient loads in our lakes. And that would be something that would be a good question for Land and Water, because I honestly don't know if we can be more restrictive than that. And then that could possibly lead into a policy decision, and that as far as if the county wanted to add some kind of requirement, but it's not typically, and that's something that would be regulated in a zoning ordinance. And but typically in that it could be as one of the conditions on the conditional use permit if this ever happened. Because that would be tied to that criteria condition, and that is to maintain safe and healthful conditions, and keep our water quality up there. So the committee could set that, and they could make it, whatever limit is justifiable, based on their evidence. So.
Okay. There's another question about how manure pipelines are controlled, such as using the ditches.
Good question in that. I'm not sure if there is any regulations on that. So anyway, a lot of times it's working with the towns and stuff, but yeah, it's a good question.
Okay, we have just a couple minutes left. Lisa or Andy, do you have anything to add or clarify after hearing about the conditional use permit zoning?
Yeah, I'd like to thank Jason. He's just done an incredible job for the last 2 years, putting all this information and working with these different concerns and interest groups. A couple of things that I'd point out to people is that that you can have an infinite number of hogs 200 feet from the property line. So there's no limit. And the towns that have been approached to build these hog factories are the unzoned towns. So unfortunately, this CUP process leaves our towns out, whereas the operational ordinance would cover all the towns. So we're still trying to work with the county and hoping that operational ordinance could be adopted by the county, as it has been by Bayfield and several other counties. The other thing is that there's no findings of fact for this, and that's kind of a legalistic discussion, but the county never did the work to put together the findings of fact, or maybe they have now and I don't know it. But the DATCAP, the Department of Agriculture, critiqued this earlier this summer and found that there were no findings of fact for several of the conditions. And then the last thing is on requiring a performance bond or a surety bond. We very much disagreed with the county council that that's illegal. It's in a rule, a state rule, but the rule is illegal. And we know that's true because in February of 2020, the big ag interests tried to put it into law because it's not in the law. It's kind of a complicated deal, but we believe that the performance bond are absolutely critical to a good ordinance. So if there is any major problems, there would be insurance. But we look forward to working with the county more and have really appreciated what the staff have done. A lot, yeoman service working on it.
Thank you, Jason. That was really a comprehensive presentation and we all really appreciate it. And thank you to Lisa for being here tonight and to Andy Marshall for explaining the Eureka ordinance. And thank you to all of our board members who made this meeting possible and made it run as best as possible on the Zoom. And to our members who also support the organization with your membership. You can find out more about PCALR at our website, www.pcalr.org. I'd just like to encourage all of you to consult with your towns about creating an ordinance similar to Eureka's or adopting the same Eureka ordinance to protect us from the threats of this large farming that can be such a huge threat to our lakes and rivers and our overall ecological quality. This presentation aligns interestingly with a couple of things, the passing of Fritz Mondale, who we can credit with the Wild and Scenic Riverway Act that ensures that we have these wild rivers to enjoy, and that he worked along with Gaylord Nelson, Wisconsin Senator Gaylord Nelson, who founded Earth Day, which is tomorrow. So it's a good time to go out and pick up trash and enjoy the environment that we're blessed with here in Polk County. I thank you all for attending tonight, and at this point, the meeting is adjourned. Bye.
Sorry, I was late. I was convinced it was at 7 o'clock, so I would have been early.
Yeah, well, the one part was at 6, just the PCALR meeting in general, the meeting of members was at 6:30.
Yes, when I
Yeah.
arrived at 6:50, I understood that.
Yeah, that's okay. Did you catch any of Colton's presentation on the
Yeah,
algae?
I
Yeah,
did. I
good.
did.
Good. Yeah, that was important. That's really mysterious and concerning. So hopefully we'll get more information on that.
Yeah, and I think stressing the danger to people's pets
Yeah.
will get people more interested in that.
Well, we have had pet deaths due to toxic algae in Polk County. That's happened on Long Lake, and Larry, you might remember another one. But the dogs go in, get covered with algae, and they have a respiratory response to the toxins, and then they don't survive. And so that's what prompted Long Lake to do an alum treatment, because most of their phosphorus was loading from the sediment. And that's like what Colton pointed to, is that if the phosphorus loading is coming from the watershed, through runoff, alum's not going to help you. You have to determine what the load is from from the settlement, and that's a big process. Balsam's gone through that, Bone Lake's gone through that. And it will,
Earth Pipe has gone through it.
have you? Pipe has gone through.
But we're
well, the
still
internal-
working on it because we don't understand enough.
Yeah, yeah.
Good
Well-
job, Karen.
Oh,
Yeah.
Lots
thanks.
of work.
Well, you had 42 people. I'm impressed.
Yeah, that was really great. A lot of the attendees were from the farm community. We did have 2 supervisors. We had Brad Olson and Amy Middleton. I did see at the end, as people were signing off, that some had raised their hands, but I think that it was impossible with 42 attendees to watch for raised hands.
Okay. I
Um,
also saw people just giving a thumbs up.
Oh, okay,
Maybe.
okay.
I'm not sure if it was probably both of those things.
A lot of folks came on after the housekeeping slide, so they probably didn't catch the thing about the questions would be in chat, but I tried to keep that kind of going. So that's it. I think I have a Manhattan out there waiting for me, so I'm gonna go.
I
night.
have
I'm
a
gonna
bowl
go-
of ice cream.
I'm gonna go see what that looks like.
Enjoy. Bye-bye.
Okay.
night.
good
Thank
night.
you.
Thank you.